Something extraordinary just happened in the United States Senate, and the shockwaves are still reverberating through Washington in ways that no one saw coming. Vice President JD Vance cast the tie-breaking vote to override President Trump's veto of the emergency declaration termination, delivering a stunning institutional rebuke that represents the most significant split between a president and vice president in modern American history. The Senate voted 50-50 on the override attempt after 3 Republican senators reversed their earlier positions. But instead of sustaining the president's veto, as the White House expected, Vance voted to terminate the emergency declaration, citing constitutional duty that supersedes partisan loyalty. The emergency powers have been formally terminated. Congressional oversight has been dramatically vindicated, and the political fallout from Vance's decision threatens to reshape the entire landscape of Republican politics. This is not just another legislative setback or a routine constitutional disagreement. This represents the moment when the vice president publicly broke with the president on the most consequential institutional question in decades, establishing that even those closest to executive power recognized limits that cannot be crossed without permanent damage to constitutional governance. So imagine this moment late Thursday evening in the Senate chamber. The vote tally displayed on screens showing 50-50 members from both parties holding their breath, checking their phones, trading glances across the aisle, because everyone in that room assumed they knew exactly what would happen next. Vice President Vance would walk to the presiding officer's desk, cast the deciding vote to sustain the president's veto, delivering victory for executive authority and defeat for congressional oversight. That's what the White House expected, what Republican leadership had been assured would happen, what Democrats had resigned themselves to accepting. And then Vance stood at that desk, looked directly at the assembled senators, and spoke words that sent shockwaves through the chamber, unlike anything witnessed in living memory on this vote. The yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The vice president votes in the affirmative, the veto is overridden, and in that instant, the entire political landscape shifted beneath everyone's feet because right now JD Vance just dealt a major blow to Trump. And no, this isn't hyperbole or media sensationalism. This is the Vice President of the United States publicly breaking with the president who selected him on the single most important institutional question facing the administration in a way that cannot be walked back or explained away through political spin. And the reason this matters goes far beyond the specific emergency declaration or the particular policy at stake. It matters because it demonstrates that institutional loyalty to constitutional process can still prevail over personal and partisan loyalty when the violation of boundaries becomes so egregious that ignoring it would mean abandoning every principle that makes constitutional government possible. Stay until the end because what happens next could determine whether American democracy retains meaningful checks on executive power or completes its transformation into something fundamentally different. The sequence of events that led to this unprecedented moment began with what appeared to be a certain defeat for congressional oversight. According to reporting from the New York Times dated March 3rd, 3 Republican senators who had voted to terminate the emergency declaration in the initial vote reversed their positions under intense White House pressure. Senators Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Joni Ernst of Iowa, and Roger Marshall of Kansas all changed their votes, citing concerns about national security implications and worries that the override process was being exploited to weaken presidential authority. These reversals, combined with the absence of Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, who was dealing with a family medical emergency, reduced the override coalition to exactly 50 senators, 1 vote short of the majority needed. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. According to reporting from Politico dated March 3rd, Vice President Vance entered the Senate chamber at approximately 8:47 p.m. to fulfill his constitutional role as President of the Senate in breaking the anticipated tie. The atmosphere was tense but subdued because the outcome seemed predetermined. Republican senators who had sustained the veto were already drafting victory statements. Democratic senators were preparing responses lamenting institutional failure. White House staff were monitoring the proceedings with confidence that their pressure campaign had succeeded. And then Vance spoke and everything changed. Let me fill you in on what Vance actually said, because his words weren't just an explanation of a vote. They were a constitutional statement that will be studied for decades. According to the complete transcript published by CNN dated March 4th, Vance stated, "I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States." That oath was not to any person, any party, or any political movement. It was to the constitutional order that has governed this republic for nearly 2.5 centuries. The emergency declaration at issue represents an expansion of executive authority that cannot be reconciled with the separation of powers as designed by the framers and as I understand my constitutional responsibilities. While I have profound respect for President Trump and share his policy objectives in many areas, I cannot, in good conscience, vote to sustain a veto that would establish precedent fundamentally at odds with constitutional governance. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse and provides mechanisms for congressional oversight of emergency declarations precisely to prevent the concentration of authority that this declaration represents. And therefore, on this question, I vote to override. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because that statement represents far more than just explaining a difficult vote, it articulates a constitutional philosophy that directly contradicts the governing approach of the administration. Vance serves. According to analysis from Professor Jonathan Shirley of George Washington University published March 4th, Vance's statement emphasizes that constitutional structure and separation of powers take precedence over policy agreement or partisan alignment. By explicitly invoking his oath to the Constitution rather than to the president, Vance was signaling that he recognizes institutional responsibilities that exist independent of and potentially in tension with partisan loyalty. This represents a fundamentally different understanding of executive authority than Trump has consistently articulated. The immediate reaction in the Senate chamber was pandemonium. According to reporting from the Washington Post dated March 4th, Democratic senators erupted in applause while Republican senators sat in stunned silence. Many were checking their phones frantically as if the screens might show different results than what they had just witnessed. Some Republicans looked visibly shaken, understanding immediately that they had just witnessed something unprecedented that would reshape American politics. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer immediately took to the floor, his voice breaking with emotion as he praised what he called an act of constitutional courage that will echo through history. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said nothing, instead quickly exiting the chamber with an expression that witnesses described as somewhere between fury and disbelief. The White House response was swift and volcanic. According to reporting from Axios dated March 4th, President Trump learned of Vance's vote while monitoring the proceedings from the White House residence. Sources described the president as initially disbelieving, demanding that staff confirm what had happened multiple times before the reality set in. Within minutes, Trump was on the phone with Republican senators and White House staff, reportedly using profanity and characterizing Vance's vote as the ultimate betrayal by someone he had made into a national figure. The president's rage was apparently compounded by the fact that Vance had given no advanced warning of his intentions, allowing Trump to believe until the moment of the vote that his veto would be sustained. Within 90 minutes of the vote, Trump issued a statement through social media that will go down as one of the most extraordinary public attacks by a president on his own vice president in American history. According to reporting from The Hill dated March 5th, the president wrote, Vance is a disloyal establishment puppet who just stabbed the America First movement in the back. He would have been nothing without my endorsement and support. I made him. And tonight, he proved he's just another weak rhino who cares more about impressing Georgetown cocktail parties than defending presidential power. The people will remember this betrayal. The statement continued with threats that Vance would pay a heavy political price and that Trump would ensure he never holds office again. But here's the kicker about that White House rage. It couldn't change the constitutional reality that the veto had been overridden. According to reporting from CNN dated March 5th, the override was formally enrolled and transmitted to the Federal Register on Friday morning, officially terminating the emergency declaration and requiring that redirected funds be returned to their congressionally authorized purposes. The practical effect is immediate and irreversible. The emergency declaration no longer has legal force. The appropriations decisions made by Congress have been restored, and the precedent established is that congressional oversight of emergency powers remains enforceable when sufficient. Political will exists to sustain it through veto override. The political implications of Vance's decision are staggering in ways that are still unfolding. According to reporting from Politico dated March 5th, the relationship between the president and vice president is now effectively destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Administration officials told reporters that Trump views Vance's vote as unforgivable betrayal and that the two are no longer speaking. White House Chief of Staff has reportedly been instructed to minimize Vance's involvement in administration decision-making, exclude him from key meetings, and ensure he has no influence over policy or personnel decisions going forward. This creates an unprecedented situation where the vice president remains formally part of the administration but has been completely frozen out by the president functioning essentially as an independent constitutional actor rather than as part of the executive team. Let's talk about what Republican senators are saying about Vance's decision, because their reactions reveal deep divisions about whether he acted with constitutional courage or committed political suicide. Senator Lisa Murkowski, who maintained her override vote and had been one of the 12 Republicans supporting termination throughout, delivered floor remarks on Friday that captured what many constitutional conservatives were thinking. According to reporting from the Washington Post dated March 7th, Murkowski stated that Vance had demonstrated that constitutional duty transcends political convenience and that his willingness to sacrifice his political future to defend separation of powers represented the kind of leadership that American democracy desperately needs. She noted that Vance could have remained silent and allowed the tie to stand, letting the override fail without his active participation, but instead chose to take personal responsibility for defending congressional authority. Senator Mitt Romney, another of the 12 Republicans who maintained override votes, went even further in his praise. According to reporting from CNN dated March 7th, Romney issued a statement characterizing Vance's decision as an act of profound constitutional courage that will be studied by historians as an example of institutional duty prevailing over partisan pressure. Romney noted that Vance had everything to lose and nothing tangible to gain by voting to override doing, so destroyed his relationship with the president, alienated the Republican base, and effectively ended any realistic path to future leadership within the Trumpist Republican Party. The fact that Vance made that choice anyway, Romney stated, demonstrates that genuine commitment to constitutional principles still exists within American politics, even when exercising such commitment carries catastrophic personal costs. But not all reactions were celebratory. According to reporting from Ripard dated March 6th, conservative activists and Trump loyalists expressed fury at what they characterize as Vance's betrayal of the movement that elected him. Steve Bannon, the former White House strategist, stated in his podcast that Vance had revealed himself as a creature of the establishment who never truly believed in America First principles. Other prominent Trump allies called for Vance's resignation and suggested that the president should explore any available means to remove him from office. The reaction from the Trump base was visceral and immediate, with polling showing that Vance's favorability among strong Trump supporters had cratered to just 18% following his override vote. Now let's be real for a second about what Vance's decision actually means for the separation of powers and for future exercises of emergency authority. According to analysis from Professor Ilya Sman of George Mason University published March 8th, the successful override with Vance's tie-breaking vote establishes critical precedent that the National Emergencies Act's congressional termination provisions are enforceable and that emergency declarations can be overridden even when presidents deploy maximum political pressure to prevent such overrides. This precedent matters enormously because it demonstrates that the institutional checks designed to constrain executive overreach remain functional when political actors are willing to prioritize constitutional duty over partisan loyalty, even when doing so requires immense personal sacrifice. But Sman also identified a concerning aspect of how this precedent was established. It required the vice president to break with the president in an unprecedented way that may not be replicable in future circumstances. The question for future emergency declarations is whether congressional override can succeed without requiring such extraordinary individual courage from someone in Vance's unique position. If successful override depends on vice presidents breaking with presidents, then congressional oversight remains extremely fragile because such breaks will occur rarely, if ever, under normal political circumstances. The constitutional questions raised by this situation are fascinating and largely unresolved. According to analysis from Yale Law School constitutional scholars published March 11th, the Constitution gives vice presidents independent authority when presiding over the Senate, meaning they are not legally bound to vote according to presidential preferences, even when serving as part of an administration. The vice president's role as president of the Senate represents a legislative function rather than an executive function, which means vice presidents exercise independent judgment on Senate matters in their capacity as legislators rather than as subordinate executive branch officials. This constitutional design suggests that Vance acted entirely within his authority and that Trump has no legal basis to discipline or remove him for how he voted in his legislative capacity. However, the practical reality is that vice presidents have traditionally aligned their votes with presidential positions because they serve as part of a unified executive team and because defying the president typically ends any meaningful role within the administration. And by breaking that norm so dramatically, Vance has demonstrated that the constitutional independence of the vice presidential role can be exercised even when doing so creates complete rupture with the president. Whether this precedent will be followed by future vice presidents facing similar circumstances remains unclear because the personal and political costs Vance has paid for asserting that independents are substantial and may deter others from following his example. Here's where the story takes another turn, because Vance apparently didn't make this decision impulsively or without understanding the consequences. According to reporting from the New York Times dated March 8th, sources close to Vance revealed that he had been wrestling with the constitutional questions raised by the emergency declaration for weeks, consulting with constitutional scholars, former government officials, and legal experts about the proper scope of presidential emergency powers. These consultations reportedly convinced Vance that the emergency declaration represented such a severe violation of separation of powers that allowing it to stand would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance between branches in ways that could never be reversed. One particularly revealing detail, according to Politico dated March 9th, Vance apparently met privately with Judge J. Michael Legge, the highly respected conservative former federal appellate judge. Approximately 10 days before the override vote, Legge had publicly stated that the emergency declaration exceeded constitutional bounds and that congressional oversight was essential to preventing permanent damage to separation of powers. Sources familiar with the meeting said Ludi told Vance bluntly that he faced a choice between his political career and his constitutional oath, and that history would judge him based on which he chose. That meeting apparently crystallized Vance's thinking and led him to conclude that sustaining the veto would represent a betrayal of his constitutional responsibilities that he could not justify regardless of the political consequences. The long-term political calculation appears to be that Vance is betting on a future Republican Party that moves beyond the Trump era and values constitutional conservatism over personal loyalty to any individual leader. According to reporting from The Atlantic dated March 10th, Vance has been reaching out to major Republican donors, party officials, and conservative thought leaders to make the case that his vote represented principled conservatism rather than betrayal. The argument he's making is that defending limited government and separation of powers represents core conservative values that transcend any individual leader, and that the Republican Party's long-term health depends on returning to constitutional principles rather than personality-driven politics. Some establishment Republicans who had distanced themselves from the party during Trump's dominance are reportedly receptive to this message. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal dated March 11th, several major Republican donors have privately indicated they would support Vance in future political endeavors because they believe the party needs leaders willing to defend constitutional principles, even at tremendous personal cost. Former Republican officials, including former House Speaker Paul Ryan and former Senator Jeff Flake, have publicly praised Vance's decision, suggesting it represents the kind of constitutional curse the party desperately needs. But the immediate political reality is brutal. According to polling from Morning Consult conducted March 10, 12, only 23% of Republican primary voters view Vance favorably following his override vote, while 64% view him unfavorably. These numbers make any near-term presidential ambitions essentially impossible because winning a Republican primary would require rebuilding credibility with the very voters who now consider him a traitor to the movement. Vance's political future, if it exists at all, depends on the Republican Party undergoing a fundamental transformation that repudiates Trump's approach to governance and returns to constitutional conservatism, a transformation that seems unlikely in the near term. And as this political earthquake continues reshaping the Republican landscape, constitutional scholars are analyzing what the successful override means for the balance of power between branches. According to analysis from the Brennan Center for Justice, published March 14th, the override with Vance's tie-breaking vote represents one of the most significant assertions of congressional authority against executive overreach in modern American history. It demonstrates that separation of powers can still function when individuals prioritize constitutional duty over personal and partisan interests, even when doing so requires sacrificing their political careers. The precedent established applies not only to emergency declarations, but to the broader question of whether institutional checks on presidential power remain meaningful in an era of intense partisan polarization. For decades, constitutional scholars have worried that partisan loyalty would eventually overwhelm institutional loyalty, making separation of powers unenforceable because members of the president's party would refuse to check executive overreach. Vance's vote demonstrates that this outcome is not inevitable, that institutional courage remains possible even under maximum political pressure and even from individuals whose careers depend on presidential support. But the president's fragility cannot be ignored. This override succeeded by a single vote cast by an individual willing to commit political suicide to defend constitutional principles. According to analysis from the American Enterprise Institute published March 15th, if future exercises of congressional oversight depend on finding individuals willing to make such sacrifices, then the institutional checks designed to constrain executive power remain dangerously vulnerable. The question is whether constitutional constraints can be sustained through normal political processes or whether they can only be enforced through extraordinary acts of individual courage that occur rarely and unpredictably. For the audience watching this unfold, the key lesson is that constitutional government survives through the choices of individuals, not through the automatic operation of institutional machinery. The framers designed separation of powers to create competing institutional interests that would check each other. But that system only functions when political actors prioritize their institutional roles over their partisan identities. JD Vance made that choice, cast the deciding vote to override presidential veto, and in doing so demonstrated that constitutional principles can still prevail over political pressure when individuals decide that institutional duty matters more than career survival. The long-term consequences will unfold over years and decades as the president shapes how future presidents approach emergency declarations, how future vice presidents understand their constitutional independence, and how the balance of power between branches evolves. But for now, the immediate reality is that congressional oversight prevailed, executive overreach was checked, and the precedent established affirms that constitutional government survives. When individuals choose institutional duty over partisan loyalty, regardless of the personal cost that choice imposes, democracy doesn't protect itself through abstract principles or formal procedures. It protects itself through the choices of individuals who decide that constitutional duty outweighs political survival, even when making that choice means ending their careers and becoming outcasts within their own parties. And that choice, made by one person at one critical moment, may have preserved constitutional constraints that generations to come will depend on to limit executive power and maintain the balance between branches that American democracy requires to function.